Family Guy Viewer Mail is a Season 3 episode that contains 3 mini-segments that each have their own little gimmick. This episode concept returned in Season 10, and then once again in Season 24. And with these 3 episodes, we can take a look at, in real time, the stark decline in Family Guy's comedy quality. Chapter 1, Season 3's Viewer Mail episode. Family Guy Viewer Mail number 1 from Season 3 doesn't open with the standard intro. Instead, it starts with Brian and Stewie introducing the concept of the Viewer Mail episode. The premise being that the show produced actual episodes based around the ideas that fans came up with and wrote in letters. I can't find anything confirming or denying that these segments were in fact from actual letters from fans, and if I had to guess, they probably weren't, but the concept itself does help to frame what I think the actual episode is, which is ideas the writers had for the show that wouldn't really work as full episodes, but did work as little mini anthology episodes. And by tying it up with a neat little bow of saying these ideas came from viewer mail, the fact that these stories feel just slightly different from the episodes we usually see makes them feel a little more special, and excuses the unorthodox episode structure. The regular intro does play after the Brian and Stewie intro, so it's not exactly the same as something like the Road to episodes that completely omit the standard intro in favor of the Road to intro to further communicate that it's a special episode. The first segment is No Bones About It, which actually starts out with a TV gag, which is unrelated to the main plot, much like how a normal episode would begin. This shows that this isn't so much being presented as a typical non-canon anthology episode, but a mini version of a normal episode, which isn't exactly the case for the later season viewer mail episodes. The premise of the episode is that Peter summons a genie from his beer. He uses his first wish to spy on some celebrity, and they do a joke where she's like an alien creature or whatever. Family Guy jabs a celebrity they don't like. The white bread of Family Guy jokes. I guess I appreciate the pun, at least.
You're right there, Reed. I just have to put on my face.
And the joke also distracts us from the fact that Peter just used his first wish, which does become important later. Peter's second wish is to have his own theme music, which then leads into this delightful little sequence where Peter goes around with different musical themes playing behind him. It's really one of my favorite musical sequences in the show. My only complaint about it is I wish it were longer. I think they could have had a few more music theme related gags before they got to the bus scene, which is where Peter uses his final wish when this guy is about to break all his bones for having theme music.
I wish I had no bones!
See what I said earlier about that first wish being important? The fact that Peter wasted his first wish on something so trivial made it so that when he accidentally wished that he had no more bones, he couldn't easily reverse it. What this episode has already succeeded in so far is that it uses what seem to be a bunch of random and silly gags and comedy moments to communicate to us the character of Peter and the setup of the rest of the story. The rest of the episode shows a relatively simple narrative. There's a couple of gags that show how hard life is for Peter and the family with the whole no bones thing, with Peter then deciding to leave his family, and then at the end he gets surgery to get his bones back and finds out that the rest of his family gave him the bones. It's quirky, it's silly, it's a little more wholesome than what later Family Guy would become, but it all works well, especially for a 6-minute little mini episode. The next segment of Family Guy Viewer Mail number 1 is Super Griffins, which also begins with a TV gag that's unrelated to the rest of the episode. Again, kind of treating this like a regular episode. This segment revolves around the family members all getting superpowers, and Lois stating that they should all make sure to be responsible with said superpowers. The next sequence of jokes then goes on to show each family member, Lois included, breaking that rule and using the superpowers for their own personal gain. Once they've all gone full supervillain, Peter demands that they erect a statue depicting a scene from an 80s sitcom. A joke that I think is even funnier to me because I don't get the reference. The family then learns their lesson when Mayor West gets sick from trying to get superpowers himself by rolling around in toxic waste.
Mayor West, you have lymphoma.
Similar to the first segment, it teaches a simple sitcom-y type lesson with lots of silly cartoon gags in a small amount of time. And that's just about all it needed to be. The final segment of Viewer Mail number 1 is the most unorthodox. Little Griffins is a loose Little Rascals parody with all of the adult characters being chibi-fied into these kid versions. It always kind of bugged me that they called the segment Little Griffins when technically Peter and Brian are the only Griffins. I don't actually think that's a valid criticism criticism of the title now, but I remember I didn't like the episode for that reason when I first watched it when I was 12, so yeah. As you can see, I've improved in my skills at criticizing media since then. The segment plays on typical schoolyard little kid tropes. Young Peter and Quagmire have a crush on Lois, so they dare each other to stay in this haunted house place. Of the three segments, I think comedy-wise this one is the weakest, and how much you like this segment really depends on how funny you find the baby-fied versions of the characters. But just like the first two segments, it takes a sitcom-y lesson and packages it up with some Family Guy cartoonish goodness and still manages to be a memorable segment. The segment does succeed at subverting the original Little Rascals, with instead of the young boys maturing, they swear off women entirely, which cuts away to them 35 years in the future, very rich but very much alone. It's an anti-lesson. It still teaches the same lesson of Little Rascals, you should be mature around girls, but instead of actually showing the characters mature, it shows the characters not mature and face consequences for it. But something else notable about Little Griffins is that it's actually the first time that Family Guy did a non-canon episode where the recognizable characters took on different roles. Nowadays, episodes like these are a dime a dozen, since Family Guy Star Wars showed how much people liked seeing the Family Guy characters used in all sorts of different contexts. But back in season 3, this wasn't really a thing. Every episode of Family Guy back in this era, except Family Guy Viewer Mail, was for the most part normal episodes, at least as normal as Family Guy episodes are. And in a lot of ways, that makes sense. After all, the reason that something like Family Guy Star Wars even works in the first place is because these characters are already so well known and understood within the world that they exist in, and the fact that the early seasons didn't have such parodies is why they're even able to exist at all. But I do find it interesting that back in season 3, something like an anthology episode that can be a little more loose with its writing and use its characters to create parodies was something that didn't happen all too often. As opposed to now, where it seems like every episode is some sort of parody or putting the characters in a different time period. And I think why Family Guy Viewer Mail #1 is viewed fondly despite being an anthology is that it didn't use its high concepts and parody elements as a crutch for its writing. It still went out of its way to have some sort of story, some sort of lesson. And all of the jokes and gags work better because they exist within that structure. Chapter 2. Season 10's Viewer Mail episode. The first major difference between Season 10's Viewer Mail episode and Season 3's is that the regular Family Guy It Seems Today intro is placed at the very beginning of Season 10's episode before we see Brian and Stewie surrounded by mail, whereas the Season 3 episode was the opposite. Now, this decision was probably just an oversight or bureaucracy. Maybe no one remembered that Season 3's episode was structured this way. Maybe the rules on where the intro has to go were more rigid by the time the show was in Season 10. But it's interesting how the episode beginning with the same intro most episodes have makes this episode seem like so much less of an event as compared to Season 3's Viewer Mail that started right off the bat with Brian and Stewie telling us this was going to be a different kind of episode. As of Season 10, there were plenty more high-concept episodes, non-canon episodes, and parody episodes. The Star Wars episodes, of course, were not too far back in recent memory, but this was also past such episodes as Griffin Family History, which parodied time periods, Three Kings, which parodies Stephen King novels, and Peter's Progress, which parodies the colonial age. Not to mention how Stewie has gone full science fiction by this point. Unlike in Season 3, where just about every episode stayed grounded in a similar sort of reality, with sure, some high concepts here and there, but Viewer Mail still felt like it was a particular deviation. Whereas Viewer Mail #2 in Season 10 competes for our attention with a myriad of other high concept episodes, most of which are just more memorable. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. Shows change and Family Guy moved on from a more grounded family sitcom to tell crazier stories. But in that environment, the Viewer Mail episode almost seems outdated. Season 10 was an incredibly mixed season of the show. The season contained highly infamous episodes like Seahorse Seashell Party and the domestic violence episode, but it also included Back to the Pilot and Forget Me Not, which I think are pretty strong episodes. I think it's worth noting, though, that those two strong episodes are also high-concept episodes, which communicates to me that the show is struggling a bit at this point to tell more grounded stories. And within this soup of downright bad episodes, a few good ones with high concepts, a whole lot of mediocrity in that one dull dolphin episode, we get Family Guy Viewer Mail #2, which begins with a segment where all of the characters are British. Except Stewie, because he's usually British. Coming straight from watching the viewer mail of season 3, this feels so much more gag first, story second. And to be fair, Family Guy pretty much always is gag first, story second. Even the episode I just praised. But at least in season 3, the story didn't feel like it was that far behind in second, The first segment does begin with a TV segment. And when I talked about Family Guy viewer mail number 1, I mentioned that the TV segments helped make it feel like they were normal episodes rather than these parody anthology episodes. But even though it's a TV gag that starts off this British segment, it's still in line with the whole British thing, so it doesn't even really feel like a regular TV gag. The segment has a small thread of story about British Peter wanting to get a lock of Queen Elizabeth's hair to prove he's related to her, so some hijinks ensue. I guess it's something. It comments on Peter being arrogant and irresponsible, but if you compare it to the formula of the first viewer mail episode, you can see some cracks. The next segment starts with Peter getting mad at the roast of Robin Williams, and then he gets struck by lightning, causing him to get cursed where everyone he touches turns into Robin Williams. The segment just seems like it's the writers expressing that they weren't a fan of Robin Williams' comedy or acting. Which, by the way, in case you were wondering, he was still alive at the time this episode was released. But yeah, someone on the Family Guy writing staff really didn't like Robin Williams. And the segment is quite reference heavy. Like I said earlier, how the one joke about Peter wanting them to make a statue depicting a highly specific sitcom scene is funny irregardless of if you get the reference. But I feel like for this episode, I need to watch like 10 movies in order to get all the references. And sure, I guess they're pretty well-known movies, but yeah, I think it's a bit too reference heavy, even by Family Guy's reference heavy standards. As far as story goes, I don't really see one. Peter didn't ask to turn everybody into Robin Williams, he just expressed that he liked Robin Williams. But I guess that's supposed to be his character flaw? Maybe that's the story? If you enjoy someone, you'd get tired of them if they're the only thing in your life? I can kind of see that, but it probably would have been communicated better if Peter was portrayed as like obsessed with Robin Williams, rather than him just being like, yeah, I like him. It's supposed to be a play on the Midas touch, but I don't think King Midas was just like, yeah, I like gold a reasonable amount. The last segment is Point of Stew. It's one of those show episodes where you see directly through a character's eyes. It's a bit unfocused, just a series of interconnected bits and gags that don't really say much. Feels so much like missed potential, because an episode like this, where you're literally seeing through the eyes of a character and hearing their thoughts, is such a unique opportunity for us to actually empathize with them and get a window into their psyche. But no, let's just have a couple of gags, I guess. There's also 2 incredibly mean-spirited moments here. The first is the whole part where Meg gives Stewie her ring that's a really important possession to her. If you don't get that joke, it's a self-harm red flag, and that's basically the whole joke. Haha. And they also have some needless animal cruelty where Brian runs over a squirrel with his car. I really don't understand the logic of writing a joke in a show where the prerequisite for laughing at the joke is being a psychopath. Like, are there actually people out there that laugh out loud to these animal cruelty jokes? And I think it's quite telling that the presence of these incredibly mean-spirited jokes are present within a segment that has absolutely no story. I mentioned this in my mean-spirited SpongeBob episodes video, a link in the description, where I pointed out that when you don't really have any focus in your story, you can't really come up with things to do on the screen. And in a comedy show, when backed up against the wall and unable to come up with a good joke because you didn't do the work needed to set up the proper story where good jokes can thrive, you devolve into mean-spirited nonsense. Family Guy viewer mail 2 perfectly sums up where Family Guy was in arguably its darkest era, trying to be flashy with high concepts, but so unable or unwilling to engage with actual storytelling that it devolves into pointless action, unfunny jokes, too many references, and just plain mean-spirited moments that just leave you feeling icky. But this Family Guy, in a lot of ways, doesn't exist anymore, as this episode and this era of Family Guy that feels like it was just yesterday was actually well over a decade ago. 14 years ago, to be exact. So when Family Guy just this year decided to revisit the viewer mail concept, how did they do? Chapter 3, Season 24's viewer mail episode. Season 24 puts a modern spin on the viewer mail concept with viewer DMs. The first viewer DM references how Chris used to wear an earring in the early seasons, and from there crafts a whole Lord of the Rings parody around Chris's old earring being the One Ring. I think it's strange that the first segment of viewer DMs is a pop culture parody akin to Family Guy Star Wars, because Family Guy does a lot of these 3-something episodes, where it's 3 parodies with some sort of theme. In fact, this very season had 2 other 3 parodies episodes, with Playtime being a parody of 3 different plays, and High School History being a parody of 3 different historical wars. So it almost seems like this Lord of the Rings parody was supposed to be in one of these 3 parodies episodes, but they just never really found the right place for it. So they ended up just squishing it into viewer DMs. And the first thing I thought when I saw that Family Guy made a 6-minute Lord of the Rings parody was, why didn't they just do another Family Guy Star Wars, but with Lord of the Rings? You know, because Family Guy Star Wars got a 44-minute episode for each of the 3 movies in the original trilogy. But truth be told, I don't know if Lord of the Rings really would have worked as that major of a parody. Star Wars just kind of had a lot of elements to it that made it perfect for a Family Guy parody. But I'd really need to deeply research Star Wars and Lord of the Rings with that in mind to properly make that judgment. But off the top of my head, I feel like Star Wars works in ways that Lord of the Rings just kind of wouldn't. Though if there's anyone who considers themselves a Lord of the Rings expert, please let me know in the comments below if you think it could have made for a good parody. From what I can see in this Lord of the Rings parody is that it retreads a lot of the same things that Family Guy Star Wars already kind of did. You know, Herbert being Gandalf just makes me go, yeah, like when Herbert was Obi-Wan. You know, it just doesn't really work twice, even if you are parodying a different movie. I feel similarly to Stewie being Gollum, that it's just like, yeah, like when Stewie was Darth Vader. It was lightning in a bottle seeing these characters as Star Wars characters back in the day. But doing it with another film franchise that has characters that all fit similar archetypes just doesn't hit the same. There's also a couple jokes that I think just a little bit promote media illiteracy, like this one.
If there's one thing that's awesome to show in a big action movie, it's meetings.
But yeah, of course action movies are supposed to have meeting scenes. They are there to give stakes to when the action happens. And then like 5 seconds later, Chris makes this joke.
Can't Gandalf just fly me to Mordor on a giant eagle?
No, you gotta walk.
First of all, this is like a super common criticism. I can't believe this episode has the audacity to put a frequently asked Reddit question as some kind of original joke. And secondly, it's not even a correct criticism. There's like a million reasons the Eagles couldn't take them to Mordor. And most importantly, this sort of, why didn't we just take the Eagles cold take leans into a deep misunderstanding of the point of stories and why we tell them. Like, the entire world of Lord of the Rings is fiction. Tolkien could have just said that Frodo got in a teleporter and destroyed the ring the moment Bilbo gave it to him. But if Tolkien did do that, well, the story wouldn't have risen to the prominence that it had today. The point of Lord of the Rings, or any story for that matter, is to share a perspective through showing a character's journey. And in order for that to be accomplished, the character has to go on that journey. And when you make dumb comments about eagles, you're missing the point of all of that. And look, I don't think that the writers put these jokes in because of some sinister agenda against people being media literate. I think that the writers just don't really have a lot of jokes to make using Lord of the Rings, so they're just kind of grasping at straws. And when jokes like that are made because the comedy writers aren't doing a very good job, it ends up unintentionally spreading media illiteracy. And look, jokes like this can be done well. For example, in Blue Harvest, the first Family Guy Star Wars episode, there's a joke that pokes fun at the whole Death Star has a tiny hole in it that if you shoot it, the entire thing blows up situation.
You shoot a laser into this hole, the station blows up.
That sounds like a pretty big design flaw.
Now, similar to the eagle thing in Lord of the Rings, this is a media illiterate criticism where the watcher questions some kind of logistical problem that the movie not only has an in-universe answer for. In the case of the exhaust port on the Death Star, it's because a space station of that size would need an exhaust port, and the Empire thought no one would be able to shoot said exhaust port because Luke, used the Force to make that, literally said in the movie, 1,000,000 to 1 shot. But also, the existence of the Death Star exhaust port is necessary to the story and the character arc of Luke Skywalker. However, I forgive all of this in the Family Guy Star Wars exhaust port joke, because the joke is not just Stewie Darth Vader saying, oh, the Death Star can be blown up if you shoot into this one exhaust port, isn't that silly, like the Lord of the Rings Eagle joke, but instead it uses this commonly known Star Wars criticism to lead into a hilarious scene where Darth Vader's Stewie argues with one of the Empire guys about real estate value. And that's what makes the joke work.
I find your lack of faith disturbing. That property is in a prime location.
Anyway, I think these recent few minutes might go down in history as the most pedantic couple of paragraphs I've ever written for this channel, but I hope you enjoyed anyway. So the next segment is a period piece, with the joke being that it's the Oregon Trail, but they're going the other way. You know, because Family Guy takes place in New England. And again, it's weird that in viewer mail, they have a segment that feels like it could have been a part of any parody episode. In fact, just a few episodes after this one in this same season, they have a Western parody that's a full episode. And then there's the aforementioned high school history that also puts the characters in different time periods. It's just so many different episodes that's just what if Peter was in X time period, and they just don't do anything with it other than that. And I think that this is fundamentally missing the point of what Family Guy viewer mail was in its original incarnation. While the first Family Guy viewer mail did have that Little Rascals parody at the end, it leaned much more into being original. And the first two segments of that episode felt more so like mini versions of regular Family Guy episodes, but with a bit more high concept writing with the genie and the superpowers and all that. And now in the viewer DMs episode, we're just getting what seemed to be rejects from other parody episodes. So the rest of the segment just kind of goes through the motions. Lots of jokes about how it sucked to live in olden times because it was easy to die. Never heard those before. They even have this whole clunky concept where there's like a bunch of Megs and they keep dying. I don't know, it's just weird to have a bunch of clones of the same character in one place. Doesn't really read, and it kind of comes off as Uncanny Valley, if you ask me. There's a sort of a semblance of story where Peter prays at the end and promises to be a better person if he's led out of the wilderness, only to immediately go back to kicking over gravestones when he promised he wouldn't do that anymore. Sure, it makes a little bit of a statement about a person being ungrateful, but doesn't really do enough for me. Oh yeah, and then it ends with Peter being on the Moby Dick boat with another joke that's just a really common criticism of the thing they're parodying.
Hey, there's a whale. That's not the one specific whale that made me angry a few years back.
At least that joke actually understands the point of the story it's making fun of. That is kind of what Moby Dick is about. And then we get to the final segment of viewer DMs. And oh boy, this right here is just sad. The last segment is framed around being a variety show from the 1960s starring Quagmire. Timeline not making sense aside, who is this reference even for? Like, okay, it's one thing to make a joke about 80s sitcoms in 2002. There's a decent enough amount of people who might get the reference, and if they don't, no biggie, there's plenty of other jokes. But to revolve an entire 6-minute segment around referencing a type of television that you would have to be at minimum 60 years old to even have a chance of getting the reference of is bold. But it's not so much that the references are dated, okay? Maybe in a lot of ways that could have been fine. After all, it's good to reference and try to preserve different pieces of media from times gone by, like how some people still try to create old-timey radio dramas in modern day. It can be charming. But this segment is anything but charming. I have never seen so many unfunny duds of jokes just constantly being misfired. There's just like a million cuts to all of these desperate and obvious excuses of jokes, and it's all framed through this nothing TV variety show parody premise. Haha, TV shows are silly even though bad news happens sometimes. Haha, it's weird that people in the 60s drank milk with dinner. Haha, feeding children. It seemed almost like this segment was going to have some kind of story with the Lois parody character, which, by the way, it's weird that Lois is taking on the role of a different character while Quagmire is still supposed to be Quagmire. Whatever, they don't care. I thought this part was going to have some kind of arc, or Quagmire at least. But no, it just does exactly what you'd expect it to be. Old-timey character makes sexist joke and the woman gets mad. And sure, the butt of the joke is Quagmire himself for being sexist, I get that, but it's not enough. And then it ends off with this.
The entire 1960s have concluded, and the 70s will have no time for this.
Well, I hope the 2030s doesn't have time for this BS either. And all of this is pretty indicative of where Family Guy is now. It's just going through the motions, trying and failing to make some jokes using these characters. In looking at these 3 different episodes, we can see 3 pretty different eras of the show. Now, in looking at the entire series, I think there's a bit more than these 3 eras, but from the viewer mail episodes alone, we can see a Family Guy that was interested in telling actual stories, a Family Guy that still had a good joke here and there, but came off as completely mean-spirited and hollow, and a Family Guy that softened off a bit of those rough edges, but completely lacks any semblance of direction or ability to make any sort of decent jokes. I'm having trouble deciding which is worse of the latter 2. So let me know in the comments below. And hey, thank you so much for watching. If you want to see one of my other Family Guy videos, like my analysis of Sneakers O'Toole, check out this video right here. And if you want to see me tear apart an AI Family Guy content farm video, check out this video right over here. If you like what I do and want to see me do more of it, consider becoming a channel member or supporting my Patreon. See you next time.